Jane lived in a small, quiet town called Liberty Falls, a place where everyone knew everyone else, and where stories, both good and bad, stuck to you like glue. Jane's story was one of the latter. From the moment she could walk, she had a dream. She wanted to be a soldier. Not just any soldier, but a special kind, one who served with the best of the best. She read books about military history, watched documentaries about famous battles, and spent her free time running, lifting weights, and practicing self-defense. Her father, a kind man who had worked in the local factory his whole life, saw her dedication and just smiled. Her mother, a practical woman who ran the local diner, worried. She wanted Jane to have an easier life, maybe go to college and become a teacher. But Jane's mind was made up. Her passion, though, wasn't seen as noble by everyone. In Liberty Falls, the older men who gathered at the VFW hall every Friday night liked to talk about the good old days. They'd served in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf. They wore their pride like a uniform, and they saw a young woman like Jane as little more than a child playing make-believe. The leader of their group was a man named Hank. He had a big, booming laugh and a handshake that could crush rocks. He'd lost his son in the war years ago, and he seemed to have a chip on his shoulder about anyone who wasn't the real deal. He'd always say things to her, little comments that were meant to sting. "Look at Jane, the little wannabe soldier with her fancy boots," he'd say to his friends, "thinking she's going to be in the army. Ha! She'd last about 5 minutes." His words and the laughs that followed were like tiny stings. They didn't break her, but they hurt. She'd put on a brave face, maybe offer a quiet nod and keep walking. But at night, she'd lie in her bed staring at the ceiling, and the words would echo. "Wannabe soldier!" The name became her shadow. The kids at school heard it and started to call her it, too. A few of the girls who were jealous of her strong arms and fierce focus would whisper it behind their hands as she walked by. Even some of the teachers who didn't know any better would use it as a joke. "Well, if you don't get this done, Jane, you can forget about your big military dreams," she kept going. She ran every morning, rain or shine. She worked a part-time job to save up for new gear. She wrote letters to recruiters and filled out applications. She knew the name wasn't true. She was a soldier. She just hadn't gotten her chance to prove it yet. Her father, seeing her struggle, would put an arm around her and say, "Don't let them get you down, sweetie. The people who matter will see who you are." But it was hard to believe him when the whole town seemed to be against her. One day, everything changed. A thick white envelope arrived in the mail. It had no return address, just a fancy seal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter, thick and formal. It was an acceptance letter from a highly competitive program, a special training course that prepared future soldiers for the toughest roles in the military. It was her dream, a chance to prove everyone wrong. The letter was an invitation to a place far away, a place where people would take her seriously. She showed her parents, and for the first time in a long time, her mother's face wasn't filled with worry, but with a kind of proud surprise. Jane finally felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The feeling was pure joy, but a small part of her still heard Hank's voice in her head. "Wannabe soldier!" She knew her journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning of her fight to earn respect. The military training base was a world away from Liberty Falls. Here, there were no quiet main streets or familiar faces. The air smelled of sweat and pine, and the days were a blur of hard work. Jane was in her element. She moved with a confidence she'd never had back home. The drills were tough, the instructors were demanding, and the other soldiers were the best she'd ever seen. Most were men, big and strong, and they looked at her with a mix of curiosity and doubt. She could see it in their eyes, the same look she'd seen in Hank's. She knew she had to work twice as hard to prove herself, and she did. She was one of the fastest runners on the team. She could carry her pack for miles without complaint. She was quick to learn, quiet when she needed to be, and always ready to help. She didn't just meet the standards, she blew past them. The instructor started to take notice. A grizzled old sergeant named Johnson would nod at her from time to time, a sign of respect that meant more than any spoken word. She started to feel like she belonged. She wasn't a wannabe anymore. She was a soldier. But the past had a way of catching up to her. On the rare times they were allowed to use their phones, Jane would check social media. The posts from her old friends were a mix of good wishes and cruel jokes. Some of the guys from the VFW hall were still commenting on her pictures, using that old nickname. "Look at our little wannabe soldier trying to be a man," one comment said. "How long you think she'll last?" The words felt like a punch to the stomach. They had followed her all this way, the one who noticed her the most. And for all the wrong reasons was a young soldier named Mark. He was one of the loudest, most confident guys in the group, but he wasn't as good as he liked to pretend. He struggled on the long runs and was clumsy with some of the equipment. He was used to being the best, and seeing a woman, especially one he thought was weaker, pass him with ease made him angry. He felt like she was a threat to his place in the group. He'd make little comments, just like Hank, about how she was too emotional for the military or how she'd crumble under pressure. Jane mostly ignored him. She wasn't there to make friends. She was there to become a soldier. One afternoon, they were doing a tough training exercise, a night mission deep in the woods. They had to use a special kind of radio to talk to the base. Jane was the last person to use the radio before they left. She checked it twice, made sure it was working, and placed it back in her pack. Mark was standing nearby, watching her. As soon as she turned her back to talk to an instructor, he slipped a small tool from his pocket and did something to the radio. She didn't see it. No one did. Later that night, the radio didn't work. The signal was weak, and her messages wouldn't go through. The mission was a failure. The instructors, angry and confused, demanded to know what happened. They checked her pack and found the radio, its antenna bent in a way that couldn't have been an accident. They looked at her with disappointment in their eyes. Sergeant Johnson, the one who had respected her, looked at her as if he'd never seen her before. Jane swore she hadn't done it. She explained that she had checked it just before they left. Mark, standing in the back of the group, just shook his head. "We all saw her with it," he said quietly, a lie that everyone in the dark could hear. Without proof, Jane's word meant nothing. The training was over for her. She was a problem, a bad egg. She was sent home, disgraced, her dream shattered. She flew back to Liberty Falls, a failure in the eyes of everyone, even her own. Returning to Liberty Falls was harder than Jane had imagined. The town that had once mocked her now looked at her with a mix of pity and quiet satisfaction. The wannabe soldier had proven them right. She was a failure. When she walked down Main Street, people avoided her eyes. When she went to the VFW hall to see her father, Hank just shook his head slowly. "Told you so, didn't I, little girl?" he said, not with anger, but with a sad, knowing look that was somehow worse. She felt a deep, raw shame that burned hotter than any fire. For a few weeks, she stayed in her room, barely talking to anyone. Her father brought her food. Her mother sat by her bed and just held her hand. She felt like she had nothing left. Her dream was gone, and with it, her purpose. She thought about what to do next. She could leave town, go somewhere no one knew her story, and start over. But a part of her, the strongest part, refused to run. She knew she was not a failure. She had been wronged, and running would just prove them right. So she decided to stay and face her life in Liberty Falls, not as a victim, but as a person who had a purpose, even if it wasn't the one she had planned. She started small. She cleaned out her room, helped her mother at the diner, and just started doing things for others. She saw a flyer at the community center for a first aid class for kids and signed up to help. The woman who ran it, a kind nurse named Evelyn, was surprised to see her. "I heard you were back," she said. Jane just nodded. Jane had learned a lot in her brief time at the military base, and she had kept every single book and notebook. She knew more about first aid and survival than anyone else in town. She started to teach the kids things they had never seen: how to tie a special kind of knot, how to make a shelter with just a few sticks and a tarp. She taught them how to look at a wound and know what to do. The kids loved her. They didn't see a failure. They saw a leader. They saw someone who knew what they were doing. At night, when everyone was asleep, Jane would go out and run. She would run farther and longer than she ever had before. She would run until her lungs burned and her legs ached, until the shame and the anger in her heart were replaced with the simple, tired feeling of a job well done. She went to her old training spot, a small hill on the edge of town, and practiced her drills. She taught herself to be stronger and faster. She wasn't training for the military anymore. She was training for herself. Her body was a tool, and she was getting it ready for whatever came next. One day, while teaching the kids how to use a compass, a young boy named Leo looked up at her and said, "My dad says you're a real soldier, Jane. He says you're tougher than anyone he knows." Jane was surprised. She didn't know who the boy's father was, but the words felt good. They were a small, tiny crack in the wall of shame she had built around herself. She wasn't looking for praise anymore. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. Her quiet work in the town, her dedication to helping others was her new path. She was still strong, still brave, still a soldier. Her uniform just looked different now. The weather in Liberty Falls was usually gentle and predictable, but not that year. The storm came out of nowhere, a dark, churning mass of wind and rain that blew through the town like a beast. The creek that ran through the middle of town, usually a lazy trickle, swelled into a raging monster. Power went out, trees fell, and within hours the town was cut off from the rest of the world. Water filled the streets and people were trapped in their homes. The few police and firefighters in town were overwhelmed. Panic set in. People were shouting, children were crying. The townspeople of Liberty Falls, who had always been so proud of their independence, suddenly felt very small and helpless. That's when Jane stepped in. Her years of training, her hours of running, her endless practice with ropes and knots all came together in a moment. She moved with a clear purpose, a calm in the middle of the storm. She didn't wait for orders. She knew what to do. She grabbed a rope and a small boat and started pulling people from their homes. She organized the younger men who had never served and gave them jobs. She told them where to go, what to do, and how to stay safe. They didn't question her. They just did what she said. The storm raged for hours, but Jane didn't stop. She set up a makeshift clinic in the community center, using the first aid skills she had learned and taught to the kids. She cleaned wounds, wrapped broken bones, and comforted scared children. She was a beacon in the dark. The men from the VFW hall, the same ones who had called her a wannabe, were now following her orders. Even Hank, his face pale and his hands shaking, came to her. "My wife is trapped on our roof," he said, his voice small and full of fear. Jane just looked at him, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding. "Show me where," she said, and together they went to get her. Just as the storm began to calm, a helicopter appeared in the dark sky, its bright light cutting through the clouds. It was the National Guard here to help. They landed in a small, flat field on the edge of town. Out stepped a group of soldiers, but they weren't the National Guard. They were Navy SEALs, an elite team that had been called in to help with the worst of the flooding in the area. They looked tough and serious, their faces covered in a kind of silent focus. They saw the small army of people Jane had organized, moving with purpose, bringing food and blankets to the shelter. They saw the way people looked at her with respect and trust. A tall, gray-haired SEAL, a senior chief, just watched her from a distance. He didn't say anything. He just looked, his eyes taking in everything she did, the way she moved, the quiet authority in her voice. He saw a soldier, not a wannabe. He saw something more. He saw a leader. He saw someone who had a rare kind of strength, one that wasn't about shouting or being the biggest, but about being calm and ready when everyone else was afraid. As the sun began to rise, a local news crew arrived and they started to interview people about the storm. A reporter asked Hank what happened. Hank looked at Jane and then back at the reporter, his face full of a new kind of respect. "We're alive because of her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's the one who saved us. She's the real deal." The words were a kind of apology, a kind of justice, but Jane wasn't listening. She was too busy helping others. The senior chief just stood there watching, his face unreadable. The days after the storm were a blur of work and recovery. Jane helped everyone she could, never stopping, never asking for a thank you. The townsfolk, humbled and grateful, now looked at her differently. The old nickname was gone, replaced by a quiet respect. People called her Jane, and sometimes, our Jane. Even Hank, the man who had mocked her for so long, came to her with a piece of pie from his wife and a handshake that was no longer a show of strength, but a sign of genuine respect. One afternoon, as Jane was helping to clear a downed tree, the senior chief from the SEAL team walked up to her. He was alone. He didn't have a smile on his face, just that same serious look. Jane braced herself, unsure of what he wanted. "I saw what you did here," he said, his voice low. "You did good. Better than most." Jane just nodded, a little embarrassed. "Thank you, sir," she said. He shook his head. "That's not why I'm here." He paused for a moment, looking at her with an intense gaze. "I saw your file, Jane, your military file. The one from the training course." Jane's heart sank. The shame came flooding back, a cold wave of a failure she thought she had left behind. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "There was a problem with my radio. A misunderstanding." The senior chief nodded slowly. "There was no misunderstanding, Jane. We found the problem. The radio was tampered with. It wasn't you." Jane was stunned. She hadn't expected this. She felt tears well up in her eyes, a kind of relief she hadn't known she was waiting for. She hadn't been crazy. She hadn't been a failure. Someone had known the truth all along. "We ran the report on the incident," he continued. "We know who did it. The soldier who sabotaged your gear. He was a bad apple. He's been removed from the program." The senior chief looked at her for a long time. "What you did here," he said, his voice even softer now, "was real. That kind of strength, that kind of courage, it isn't something you learn. It's who you are." Then he did something that surprised her. He pulled out a small worn piece of paper from his pocket. It was a new kind of application. It was an invitation to a different program, one she had never heard of before. "We're always looking for people who can handle a situation when everything goes wrong," he said. "This is a small, quiet team. We don't make a lot of noise. We just get the job done. We think you'd be a good fit." Jane looked at the paper. It was a second chance, a chance to go back and get the dream she had lost. She looked at the senior chief, and for the first time she saw a hint of a smile in his eyes. He saw her, not just the brave woman who saved a town, but the real soldier she had always been. Just then, the news crew from before came back to film a follow-up story. They were looking for Jane, and they saw her with the seal. The reporter held up the microphone. "Ma'am, what can you tell us about what happened here?" she asked, looking at Jane. Before Jane could answer, the senior chief stepped forward. He put a hand on her shoulder, a small silent gesture that said everything. He looked at the camera, then at Jane, and then back at the townspeople who were gathering around. His voice was loud and clear, carrying across the quiet field. "What you're seeing here isn't just a brave woman," he said. "You're seeing a soldier. And from now on, you can tell everyone she's one of our own." The words hung in the air, a final vindication. The townsfolk of Liberty Falls looked at Jane with a mix of awe and shame. She was no longer a wannabe. She was a soldier. She was one of them. And she was going to get the chance to prove it to the world.